I thought I knew my wife. 5 years of marriage, late nights at the hospital, the usual routine. But one night, I followed her, and what I saw shattered everything. A strange house, a man I'd never met, and a kid she kissed like he was her whole world. Turns out she's been hiding an entire life from me, and I never saw it coming. I don't know when exactly it started, but it was somewhere around fall 2005 when I felt it, the shift, the kind of thing that sneaks up on you. You're going through your daily routine, thinking everything's fine, and then something feels off. Samantha and I had been married for 5 years, together for 8, and for the most part, things were good. Stable. Nothing to complain about, really. You know, your regular 05 married life. CDs in the car, TiVo, making fun of the commercials on TV. We'd cook dinner, maybe throw on a movie from Blockbuster if we weren't too tired, and that was that. It wasn't exciting, but it was ours. Except that fall, she wasn't herself. And it wasn't anything dramatic either. No big blow-up fight, no slamming doors. It was subtle, like how a record skips just a little, not enough to ruin the song, but enough to notice if you're paying attention. One night, I remember it clearly because the Red Sox were playing the Yankees, and she was sitting on the couch reading. She wasn't into baseball, but she'd usually sit with me, pretending to be interested while asking me random questions about the game. It was our thing, but that night, she was different. She was reading, but more like distracted reading. She kept glancing at the clock on the wall, flipping through pages without really seeing them. It was like she was in her own little world. I made a joke, something about the Sox needing all the good vibes they could get. She barely even looked up from her book, just gave me this half smile that didn't reach her eyes. Weird. I didn't think much of it at first. Everyone has off days, right? I brushed it off. She was probably just tired. Work at the hospital had been crazy for her. Double shifts, late nights. Sam was always dedicated like that. Maybe even too much for her own good. She'd come home, kick off her shoes, and just collapse on the couch some nights, too drained to even talk. But it was part of the job, and I understood that. Then little things started piling up. We had this tradition of going to this apple orchard every October, something Sam loved. She'd drag me out there, make me wear one of those goofy sweaters, and we'd spend hours walking around, picking apples, drinking cider. I pretended to hate it, but honestly, it was one of the things I looked forward to. It was our thing. But that year, she didn't seem interested. I suggested we go one Saturday, and she kind of waved it off. I'm too tired, she said. Maybe next weekend. Except next weekend came, and she still didn't want to go. Instead, she told me she had picked up an extra shift at the hospital. We could use the money, she said, which was true, I guess. But something about it felt forced, like she was avoiding it. The more I thought about it, the more I started to notice other things. Like how she used to call me during her breaks at work. It wasn't anything serious, just a quick check-in. Hey, how's your day going? Need me to pick up anything on my way home? That sort of stuff. But those calls stopped. Out of nowhere, really. I figured she was busy. It happens. Nurses have insane schedules, especially with the night shifts. But still, it was one of those tiny changes you notice after a while. I started to wait for those calls, and when they didn't come, I felt it. That little pit in my stomach. Another weird thing? She was getting ready a lot more. And I'm not saying Sam didn't care about how she looked before, but we were married, right? We were in that comfortable phase where you don't feel the need to impress each other every single day. But suddenly, she was spending extra time in front of the mirror before leaving for her evening shifts. Perfume, makeup, doing her hair in that way she used to do when we first started dating. And I couldn't help but wonder why. I don't think it clicked for me right away. You always try to rationalize things because the alternative is too much to consider. Maybe she just wanted to feel good about herself. Maybe the new night shift had some younger nurses, and she didn't want to look like the old married lady on the block. Then came the day I found the receipt. It was a Thursday, and Sam was working late again. I was rummaging through the junk drawer in the kitchen, looking for some batteries or something. That drawer was always a mess. Random receipts, loose change, a million takeout menus. Typical catch-all. I came across a receipt from Giovanni's. Now, Giovanni's was our place. It wasn't the kind of spot we hit up on random weekdays. It was more special than that. Birthdays, anniversaries, that kind of thing. It was the first restaurant we went to after I proposed. You know how certain places just mean something? That was Giovanni's for us. So when I saw the date on the receipt, I stopped cold. It was from a few days ago, Tuesday. I'd been working late that night myself, so I figured maybe she'd grab some takeout on her way home. But this wasn't a takeout receipt. It was for a full dinner. 2 entrees, a bottle of wine, and a dessert. My mind started spinning. She hadn't mentioned going out to dinner. Hell, she hadn't even mentioned anything about Tuesday night other than being tired when I got home and already in bed. I stood there for a minute, staring at the slip of paper, trying to make sense of it. My heart was pounding, but my brain? It was scrambling, making excuses for her, for the situation. Maybe she went with a friend from work, I told myself. Maybe she didn't want to bring it up because she knew I'd been busy. But deep down, something wasn't adding up. It felt wrong, like really wrong. I put the receipt back in the drawer and closed it, telling myself I'd ask her about it later. But I didn't. Not that night. Instead, I just sat there, the TV on in the background, not even hearing it, as my mind replayed every little change in her behavior over the past few months. And that's when I realized this wasn't just one thing. It was everything. Something was happening, and I was either too blind or too scared to see it. I don't remember how long I stood there after finding that receipt. Could have been 5 minutes, could have been an hour. Time felt weird, like I was stuck in some strange loop. My mind was racing, but there was this weird calm over everything, like I was trying not to freak out too early, not to jump to conclusions. I kept telling myself I needed to wait, needed to talk to Sam first. I'm not the type to be confrontational. Never have been. I hate drama. Always prided myself on being the calm one in a relationship, you know? But this felt different, like something I couldn't just shrug off with a joke or some small talk. The more I stared at that receipt, the more my stomach churned. 2 entrees, wine, dessert. It wasn't takeout. It wasn't casual. That night, when Sam got home, I tried to play it cool. She came through the door around 11 p.m., looking exhausted as always. I was sitting on the couch, the TV on in the background, but I wasn't watching. I could hear her shuffling around in the kitchen, dropping her bag, her keys, the usual. My eyes kept flicking toward the junk drawer, where I'd shoved that damn receipt back, like it was taunting me from behind the wood. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could. "How was work?" She wandered into the living room, rubbing her neck. "Busy. Another long one." She didn't look at me, which was weird. Normally, she'd collapse onto the couch next to me, kick off her shoes, and start rambling about how crazy her day had been. I could usually count on a few stories about her patients or the nurses she worked with. But not tonight. Tonight, she headed straight for the bedroom without even stopping to talk. Something inside me snapped a little. I couldn't keep sitting there pretending everything was normal. So, I got up and followed her into the bedroom. She was pulling off her scrubs, tossing them in the laundry basket, not really paying attention to me. "Can I ask you something?" I said, trying to keep my voice light, casual. "Sure," she replied, still not looking at me, like she was distracted by something else. Maybe her exhaustion. Maybe something else. I took a breath and went for it. I found a receipt from Giovanni's today. That got her attention. She froze for a second, her hands still gripping the waistband of her scrubs, then turned to face me with a confused expression. "What?" "Giovanni's," I repeated, holding her gaze. "There was a receipt in the kitchen from a few days ago. You didn't mention going there." For a split second, her face went blank. And I mean totally blank, like she was trying to process the situation, figure out how to respond. Then she gave this little laugh, the kind people give when they're trying to brush something off as nothing. "Oh, that," she said, finally tossing her scrubs in the basket and turning back toward the closet. "Yeah, I didn't go to Giovanni's. That must have been a mistake. Maybe one of the other nurses put it in with my stuff when I wasn't looking." I stood there trying to make sense of what she was saying. "So, you're telling me it wasn't yours?" She turned back toward me, an easy smile on her face, like this whole thing was just a silly mix-up. "No, it's not mine. I mean, come on. When would I have had time to go to Giovanni's? I've been working like crazy. I'm guessing it was Karen's or someone else from the hospital. We were all kind of crammed in the break room the other day, sorting paperwork. I probably just grabbed it by accident when I was leaving." I wanted to believe her. I really did. It was such a simple explanation, right? People mix things up all the time. Her coworkers probably threw their receipts and papers into the same pile, and one ended up in her bag by mistake. It made sense. Well, kind of, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. Maybe it was the way she was too quick to dismiss it. Or maybe it was just my own paranoia creeping in, but I couldn't let it go that easily. "That's weird, though," I said, trying not to sound accusatory. I mean, it had a bottle of wine on it and dessert. Seems like a pretty big mix-up. She shrugged like it was no big deal. Yeah, I don't know. I wasn't really paying attention to what I grabbed when I left. You know how it is? Everyone's in a hurry to clock out, and we're all tossing stuff around. I'm sure Karen or one of the other girls will mention it when they notice they're missing a receipt. She laughed again like it was the most natural thing in the world. Trust me, if I had time for a nice dinner out, I would have told you. I nodded slowly, but my mind was still spinning. I didn't want to push it. After all, she had an explanation, right? And it was a good one, at least on the surface. I didn't want to be that guy, the jealous, paranoid husband who jumps to conclusions over a damn piece of paper. I'd always prided myself on trusting Sam. That's what made our relationship solid. Or so I thought. But something about the whole thing still gnawed at me. All right, I said finally, letting it go for the moment. Just wanted to check. She smiled, relieved, I think. Seriously, don't worry about it. You're overthinking. Maybe I was. That night, as she slipped into bed beside me and fell asleep almost instantly, I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to force myself to believe her, trying to convince myself that it was just a mistake, something innocent. But the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. The way she explained it away so quickly. The way she seemed so distant lately, like she wasn't really with me even when she was right there in front of me. It's funny how a single piece of paper can get under your skin like that. Something so small, so insignificant. But there it was, sitting heavy in the back of my mind, refusing to go away. And that's when the doubts started creeping in. That night, after the whole receipt incident, I lay there in the dark trying to shut my brain off. But it was like my mind had opened up some hidden door, and all these old memories started pouring through. Things I hadn't thought about in years. Funny how it happens, one little thing, and suddenly you're questioning everything. I started thinking about her shifts. For as long as I could remember, Sam had always worked crazy hours. She was a nurse. It came with the territory. I used to joke that I'd married someone who spent more time with strangers in hospital beds than she did with me. It wasn't a big deal, at least not at first. When you marry someone in healthcare, you get used to late nights, the unpredictable schedule. You don't complain. You just adjust. But the more I lay there, the more I started picking apart the timeline in my head. Like those late shifts, Sam had been working evenings pretty much our entire marriage, always telling me it was because the hospital was understaffed or someone had called out. It made sense. St. Anthony's wasn't the biggest hospital, and from what I'd heard, they were constantly shuffling people around to cover shortages. Nurses work their asses off, I got that. But I realized something then. Even back when we first got married, she had this pattern of coming home really late. I'd ask her about it, half asleep, and she'd say, "Oh, the shift ran over. We had an emergency, or I stayed to cover for another nurse." No big deal, right? That's how hospitals work, as far as I knew. And when she came home late, she was always exhausted, like bone tired. Sometimes, she'd barely say 2 words before crawling into bed, her hair still wet from the quick shower she'd take as soon as she got in. It became so normal that I didn't question it anymore. But now, in the quiet of that night, my mind started digging deeper, pulling at threads I hadn't even noticed were there. It wasn't just the late shifts, it was the extra shifts. She'd pick up hours on her days off, claiming we could use the money. Or she'd tell me about some last-minute staffing issue at the hospital, and I'd nod along, half listening while I focused on whatever was going on at work for me. Then there were the work trips. I hadn't thought about them in a while, but now, lying in bed with that nagging feeling in my gut, they suddenly fell off. Sam didn't travel a lot for work. She wasn't a doctor or some kind of medical consultant, but every so often, she'd tell me about these conferences. Professional development, she'd say. Some kind of training or a seminar about new hospital policies, that sort of thing. The first time she mentioned it, maybe a year into our marriage, I didn't even question it. It was just a few days out of town, nothing huge. But then I started remembering how these trips always seemed to pop up at odd times. Like she'd mention them out of nowhere, usually just a few days beforehand. "Oh, by the way, I have to go to this conference in Philly next week," or "I'll be in Chicago for 2 nights, just a heads up." I never went with her. There was never a reason for me to. I had my own job, my own stuff going on, and honestly, I didn't think much of it. But now that I'm looking back, something about those trips feels strange. Too sudden, maybe. Too convenient. There was this one trip that sticks out in my mind now. She had to go to a conference in D.C. for 3 days. It was right after our second anniversary. I remember because we had been planning a weekend getaway, just the 2 of us, up to some cabin in the Poconos. She told me about the DC trip the night before we were supposed to leave. I completely forgot, she had said, biting her lip like she felt bad. The hospital's been talking about this seminar for weeks, but with everything going on, I forgot it was this weekend. I didn't say much at the time. Sure, I was disappointed, but I shrugged it off. Work's work, right? It was part of being married to someone with a demanding job. She left early that Friday morning, suitcase in hand, giving me a quick kiss on the cheek and promising we'd reschedule our trip. And I just accepted it. Didn't even blink. But now I'm wondering, did she actually go to DC? Or was it something else? Someone else? I hate how your mind can do that. How it can take perfectly innocent memories and twist them until you're not sure what's real anymore. I kept replaying those trips in my head, the late-night shifts, the sudden pickups of extra hours. I couldn't help but feel like there were gaps in the story, things that didn't quite line up. I just never noticed before because I wasn't looking. And then there was this one night. I hadn't thought about it in years. It was a couple of years into our marriage, maybe 2003 or 2004. I came home late from work myself that night. I'd had a project deadline coming up, so I stayed late at the office. I didn't get home until after 9 p.m. The house was dark when I walked in, but Sam wasn't there. I figured she was still at the hospital, pulling one of her usual late shifts. I made myself something quick to eat and waited for her, flipping through channels, not really paying attention to anything. She didn't come home until nearly midnight. I remember asking her what had taken so long. She gave me a tired smile, told me they'd had a rough shift. Something about a car accident, some trauma case that had taken hours. She was exhausted, her scrubs wrinkled, her eyes heavy, so I didn't push. I let her go to bed, and that was the end of it. But now, lying there in the dark with all these memories flooding back, I started to wonder, was she really at the hospital that night? Or was that just what she wanted me to believe? The thing is, she never gave me any reason to doubt her. Not until now. I never thought to check up on her. Never felt the need to. That's not who I was. We had trust, or at least I thought we did. But the more I kept going over the past in my head, the more the cracks started to show. Maybe I had been blind. Or maybe I just didn't want to see it. Sam shifted in her sleep next to me, her back turned, breathing slow and steady. I turned to look at her, her silhouette barely visible in the faint light coming through the window. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her so badly. But that feeling in my gut, the one that had started with that damn receipt, it wasn't going away. It was getting louder. I had no proof. Nothing concrete. Just a bunch of scattered memories and a growing sense that something was wrong. And for the first time in our marriage, I wasn't sure I could trust her anymore. A few days went by after the receipt incident, and I tried my best to let it go. I really did. I went through the motions, acted like everything was fine, like that gnawing feeling hadn't taken root in my gut. I wanted to believe Sam's story, that it was just a mix-up, a receipt that somehow found its way into her stuff from work. I told myself I was overreacting, that I was being paranoid for no reason. But the doubt, once it settles in, is hard to shake. It lingers, like an itch you can't scratch. It was a Saturday afternoon. Sam was at the grocery store, and I was home alone, flipping through the channels on TV, not really paying attention to anything. Just distracted. I remember the sky was gray that day, the kind of gloomy weather that makes you want to curl up with a book or take a nap. I was considering doing just that when the house phone rang. I didn't think much of it at first. This was 2005, after all. People still used landlines back then, so getting a call on the house phone wasn't weird. I figured it was probably my mom checking in or one of Sam's friends. So I got up and grabbed the phone off the kitchen wall. Hello. There was a pause just long enough to be awkward, and then a guy's voice, low, almost like he wasn't expecting me to pick up. Hey, is Sam there? That little knot in my stomach? Yeah, it twisted a little tighter. I frowned, glancing at the clock. She'd left maybe 20 minutes ago, definitely not home. And this guy? I didn't recognize his voice. It wasn't one of our friends, not Todd, or anyone from our usual circle. Sam's not here right now, I said, keeping my voice steady. Who's calling? There was another pause. This one was longer, like he was trying to figure out how to answer. Oh, he said, his tone shifting a bit, like he was caught off guard. That's all right. I'll try her later. Wait. I pressed. Who is this? And that's when it got weird. He didn't answer. There was a slight hesitation, and then he just hung up. No name. No explanation. Just the dull click of the line going dead. I stood there, holding the phone, the dial tone humming in my ear, and that knot in my stomach. It wasn't small anymore. It felt like a boulder sitting there pressing down, heavy and hard. I hung up the phone, staring at it for a second, like maybe if I stood there long enough, it would ring again, and this guy, whoever he was, would give me some kind of reasonable explanation. But nothing happened. Just the sound of the rain starting to hit the window outside. I sat back down, but I couldn't focus. Who the hell was that? Why would some random guy be calling Sam on our house phone? And why wouldn't he tell me who he was? That wasn't normal, right? People don't just call and ask for your wife without giving a name, especially not guys. I kept telling myself maybe it was some hospital-related thing. Maybe it was a doctor or a coworker who didn't recognize my voice and panicked when I asked who he was. But something about the way he hesitated, like he wasn't expecting me to answer, stuck with me. And the way he dodged the question, that was what really bothered me. I could have called Sam right then, asked her who it might have been, but something stopped me. I don't know why, but I didn't want to bring it up yet. Maybe because I was afraid of what her answer would be, or worse, that she wouldn't have a good answer at all. I wasn't ready to go down that road. Not yet. So I let it sit. When Sam came back from the store, I kept it casual. She walked in with a few bags, setting them down on the kitchen counter. I helped her unpack, chatting about nothing, the weather, what we were going to do for dinner, how the game was on later. She didn't seem any different. Same Sam, smiling, making jokes about how she couldn't find the brand of cereal I liked. If she was hiding something, she wasn't showing it. But the whole time I kept thinking about that call. That guy. At one point, while we were putting the groceries away, I turned to her and said, "Oh, someone called for you earlier." She didn't even look up from what she was doing. "Oh yeah?" Oh. I paused, watching her carefully. He didn't say, just asked for you, then hung up when I asked who it was. She stopped for a second, her hand hovering over a box of pasta, and then she shrugged like it didn't mean anything. Weird. Maybe it was a wrong number or something. Maybe, I said, trying to read her face. But she didn't seem rattled or thrown off, just indifferent. We finished putting the groceries away, and she went about her day like normal, no hint of anything being wrong. But I couldn't shake the feeling. That call wasn't a wrong number. That guy was looking for Sam. And the fact that he didn't want to tell me who he was, that felt like a red flag. A big one. Over the next few days, I kept turning it over in my head, replaying that brief conversation. The hesitation, the hang-up. I didn't want to admit it, but it was starting to feel like there was a pattern here. The late nights, the unexplained work trips, the receipt, and now this call. I started wondering if I'd been too trusting all these years. If maybe I'd let my guard down because I wanted to believe that everything was fine, that Sam was still the same person I'd married. But now, for the first time, I felt like there was something happening behind the scenes, something I wasn't a part of. I thought I was losing my mind. Every doubt, every suspicion had been eating away at me since that phone call. The receipt, the late nights, the guy who hung up when I asked who he was, it was all swirling together in my head, forming this ugly picture I didn't want to believe. But no matter how much I tried to push it down, that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. So I made a decision, a line I never thought I'd cross. I was going to follow her. It felt wrong, like I was the one breaking our trust, but what else was I supposed to do? She wasn't giving me any straight answers, and the pieces weren't adding up. I couldn't sit around questioning everything anymore. I needed to know. It was a Friday afternoon when I finally went through with it. Sam left the house for work, same as she always did, her scrubs folded neatly in her bag. She kissed me on the cheek, said something about working late again, and how she might not be back until after midnight. "Don't wait up," she said, giving me that familiar smile, the one that now felt more like a mask than anything real. "Okay," I said, trying to keep my voice casual, but my stomach was in knots. As soon as she pulled out of the driveway, I grabbed my keys and waited a few minutes before heading out after her. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was going to change everything. I felt like an idiot, tailing my own wife like I was in some bad detective movie. But I had to do it. I had to know the truth. I followed her car, staying back far enough so she wouldn't notice. She drove to St. Anthony's, just like she always said she did. I almost felt relieved when I saw her park in her usual spot at the hospital. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe all of this was just in my head, but something told me to stay. So I parked a little ways down the street, where I could still see the hospital entrance. And I waited. Hours passed. I watched as doctors and nurses came and went. Patients got wheeled in and out, the usual hospital chaos. I kept thinking, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe she really is working these long shifts. But around 6 p.m., earlier than she claimed she would finish, I saw her walk out. And that's when things started to feel really wrong. She wasn't heading to her car. She was on the phone, talking to someone, and then, without even looking back at her car, she walked toward the curb and hailed a taxi. My heart sank. She had her car sitting right there, so why the taxi? I started my engine and followed, keeping my distance but staying close enough not to lose her. The taxi wound through the city, taking turns into parts of town I didn't recognize. The farther we went, the more uneasy I felt. She'd never mentioned anything about this area before. It wasn't on the way to anywhere we usually went. Finally, the taxi pulled up in front of a house. A quiet, suburban street, neat, well-kept lawns, the kind of place that screams family. I parked a little ways down, watching as Sam got out of the taxi. She walked up the path to the front door like she'd done it 100 times before. Not hesitating, not looking around, just comfortable, like she belonged there. And then the door opened. A man stood in the doorway, maybe mid-30s, average-looking. Not someone I recognized. I felt my hand start to shake, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The man stepped outside, smiling at her. And then they kissed. It wasn't the kind of kiss you give a friend, or even a casual acquaintance. It was the kind of kiss you give someone you're close to, intimate with. My stomach dropped, and the world seemed to tilt for a second. I could barely breathe. I kept watching, frozen, as they exchanged a few words I couldn't hear, laughing together like this was normal, like this was their life. Then, just when I thought it couldn't get worse, a boy, about 8 years old, ran out from behind the man. He looked just like Sam. My heart felt like it stopped. The boy ran straight to Sam, grinning wide, and she knelt down, wrapping her arms around him, kissing the top of his head, her face lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in. I didn't even know how long. She hugged him tight like she hadn't seen him in days, maybe weeks. The man stood there, watching them, smiling like this was just another Friday evening, like this was their family. I didn't move. I couldn't. I just sat there, watching from the car, my mind scrambling to make sense of what I was seeing. Sam, the woman I'd been married to for 5 years, had an entire life outside of me. A man, a house, and a child, who was at least 8 years old. I did the math in my head, even though I didn't want to. If that boy was 8, then Sam must have had him before we even got married. And she never said a word, not a single mention, no slip-ups, no signs, nothing. She had been living this double life for God knows how long, and I had been completely oblivious. I watched her play with the boy for a while, laughing and smiling in a way I hadn't seen in years. The man, her other man, leaned down and kissed her again before they all went inside, shutting the door behind them, like it was just another night in their normal lives. I sat there, my mind spinning, my stomach churning. I couldn't breathe right. My chest was tight, and my thoughts were racing, trying to catch up to what I had just witnessed. Sam had a family I wasn't part of. For years, I had been living in this illusion, thinking I knew her, thinking we had something solid. And all along, she had been building something else with someone else in some other part of town. I drove away slowly, my mind completely numb. I didn't know where to go or what to do. I just knew I couldn't sit there anymore, watching my life fall apart. I don't know how I got through the weekend. After seeing her with that man and the boy, their boy, my mind was running wild, bouncing between anger and disbelief. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them standing there, smiling, kissing like they were some picture-perfect family. And all this time, I'd been living a lie. I'd been married to her, shared a life with her. And she'd been what? Leading a double life? I couldn't let it sit any longer. I had to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. So, that Sunday night, I decided to confront her. She got home from her shift, her real shift this time, as far as I knew, and she seemed completely normal, like nothing was wrong. She walked into the living room, kicked off her shoes, and collapsed onto the couch like it was any other day. But it wasn't. I could barely look at her. My chest felt tight, and I was fighting to keep my voice steady as I stared at her, wondering how I'd been so blind. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "I followed you," I said, my voice low and shaky. "I followed you on Friday. I saw you with him, and I saw the boy." The color drained from her face immediately. Her whole body stiffened, her eyes wide with shock. For a moment, she didn't say anything. She just stared at me, like she was scrambling for a way to respond. I swallowed hard, trying to keep the anger from spilling out. Who is he, Sam? Who's the kid? She opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again, struggling for words. John, she started, her voice trembling. I can explain, then explain. I snapped, the bitterness creeping into my voice. You've been hiding this from me for years. You have a son? You've been seeing another man? What the hell is going on, Sam? Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked down at her hands, twisting them in her lap. She took a deep breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was shaky but clear. That boy, his name is Max. He's my son. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I already knew it, of course. I'd seen the way she held him, the way he looked at her. But hearing her say it out loud made it real. Max, I repeated, my throat tight. And you just kept this from me? This whole time? She nodded, wiping at her eyes, and her whole body seemed to deflate, like the weight of the lie had finally crushed her. I had Max before we met. I was young, barely in my 20s. His father, Adam, and I were together back then. But we broke up not long after Max was born. I wasn't ready to be a mom, not full-time, not like that. And Adam, well, he took Max with him. He moved away, and for a while I thought that was the end of it. I stared at her, my heart pounding in my chest. So, when we got married, you just decided not to tell me you had a kid? She looked at me, her eyes pleading. I wanted to tell you, John. I did. But by the time we got serious, by the time we were getting married, I didn't know how. I didn't know how to bring it up. I thought maybe it was better to leave it in the past. I didn't see Max Adam had him, and I wasn't part of their lives anymore. I thought I could move on. I shook my head, disbelief washing over me. So what? You just erased your son from your life. How do you do that, Sam? Her face crumpled, tears spilling over as she struggled to explain. I didn't erase him. She paused, collecting herself. About a year after we got married, Adam came back. He moved back to town with Max. He called me and said that Max needed his mother, that he couldn't raise him alone. And we started seeing each other again. Not romantically at first, just for Max. I felt sick. My stomach churned as her words sank in. So, you've been seeing him and your son for the entire time we've been married? And you never thought to tell me? She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I know it was wrong. I know. But it wasn't supposed to be like this. I thought I could keep it separate. I didn't want to hurt you, and I didn't want to lose Max again. Separate? I repeated, my voice rising. You've been living a double life, Sam. That's not keeping it separate. That's lying. That's betrayal. She sobbed, covering her face with her hands. And for a moment, I just stood there, staring at her, feeling completely numb. How had I missed this? How had I been so blind for so long? I never meant for this to happen, she cried. It started with just seeing Max. But then, Adam and we fell back into it. We started spending more time together. And I realized I still had feelings for him. He's the father of my child, John. We have a history. And what about us? I demanded, my voice thick with anger. What about our marriage? Did that mean anything to you? She looked up at me, her face wet with tears, and I could see the guilt written all over her. Of course it did, she said, her voice breaking. I love you, John. But Adam, he's Max's father. And Max needs his parents. He needs us to be together. I felt the floor drop out from under me. So what? You're leaving me for him? After all these years? She shook her head quickly, but I could see the hesitation in her eyes. I don't know, she whispered. I'm so confused. I love you, but I love Adam too. And Max, he's my son. He deserves to have his parents in his life. He deserves to have a family. My chest tightened, and I could barely breathe. The woman I'd been married to for 5 years had been living 2 lives, and now she was telling me she didn't even know if she wanted to stay. I felt like I didn't even know her anymore. I felt empty. So what now? I asked, my voice hollow. You're just going to walk away? You're going to leave me and go back to them? She didn't answer right away. She just sat there, staring at me with those tear-filled eyes, like she didn't know what to say. And maybe she didn't. Maybe she was as lost as I was. I don't want to lose you, she said finally, her voice soft, broken. But I don't want to lose them either. I stood there, feeling like the room was spinning. The weight of it all was crashing down on me, and I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what could be done. Everything I thought I knew about my marriage, about my life, it had all been turned upside down in a matter of days. I was left standing in the wreckage, wondering if anything could ever be put back together again. And deep down, I already knew the answer. I didn't storm out, and she didn't beg me to stay. There wasn't any big, dramatic moment with shouting or tears on the floor. After she told me everything, we just sat there, both of us quiet, both of us exhausted. The weight of the truth had drained us both, and neither of us had the energy for a fight. The TV was still on, muted in the background, flickering shadows across the room. I stared at it, not really seeing anything, just letting the silence settle in. There wasn't much left to say. Sam had lived 2 lives, and now both of those lives had caught up with her. With us. Eventually, she wiped her face with the sleeve of her sweatshirt and looked over at me. Her eyes were red, puffy from crying, but she wasn't crying anymore. She just looked tired. I guess I must have looked the same. I don't know what to do, she said softly, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm now, more resigned than anything. She sounded like someone who knew there wasn't a perfect answer. I never wanted to hurt you, John. You have to believe me. I believe you, I said, and I meant it. I didn't think she'd ever intended for things to turn out this way. I don't think she planned to lead this double life when we first got married. Life just got messy. Messier than she ever expected. But it doesn't change anything, Sam. She nodded like she understood. And maybe she did. We weren't angry anymore. That initial wave of betrayal and shock had settled into something quieter. Something sadder, but more real. Max needs you, I said after a while, my voice almost a whisper. I was staring at the TV again, but my mind was somewhere far away. I get it. He's your son. You can't just walk away from him. She didn't answer, but I could feel her looking at me, waiting for me to keep going. And I can't stay in a marriage where you're torn between 2 lives. It's not fair to me. It's not fair to you either. The words hung in the air for a long time. They didn't feel dramatic or final. They just felt like the truth. I know, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion but steady. I've been selfish. I didn't want to lose either of you. But I can't keep doing this. To you. To myself. We sat there for a long time after that. The room was filled with the quiet hum of the muted TV, the occasional sound of cars passing by outside, and the weight of all the unspoken things between us. We didn't make any decisions right then. It wasn't that kind of moment. There were no ultimatums, no tearful declarations of love or regret. Just 2 people sitting on a couch, realizing that their marriage had reached the end of the road. Eventually, I stood up. I was calm, even though everything inside me felt heavy, like I was carrying the weight of the last 8 years on my shoulders. I'm going to go for a drive, I said. It wasn't a dramatic exit, just something I needed to do to clear my head. She nodded, not asking where I was going or if I'd be back. She didn't need to. We both knew what this meant, even if we weren't ready to say it out loud yet. I grabbed my keys from the counter and headed out the door. The night air was cool, crisp, and for the first time in hours, I felt like I could breathe. I got into the car and started driving, not really knowing where I was headed, just needing to move, to let my thoughts settle. As I drove, I thought about everything. Our marriage, the good times, the laughter, the quiet nights spent on the couch watching TV. All the little moments that had made up the last 5 years of my life with Sam. And then there were the other moments, the ones I didn't know about until now. Her other life, her son, her love for Adam. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit together anymore. And the truth was, that's just how life goes sometimes. You don't always get a clear, clean break. People are messy, and relationships, even the ones that feel solid, can unravel in ways you never expected. It wasn't anyone's fault, really. It just happened. I kept driving, and after a while, the tension in my chest loosened. The hurt was still there, but it wasn't sharp anymore. It was more of a dull ache, like something I'd carry with me for a while, but would eventually get lighter. By the time I pulled back into the driveway a couple of hours later, the house was quiet. Sam's car was still there, but I wasn't sure if she was asleep or just waiting for me to come back. Either way, I knew we were done. There wasn't going to be some big fight or a dramatic exit. We'd probably talk in the morning, maybe even try to figure out the logistics of what came next. But the truth was, we both knew where this was headed. We'd drift apart, probably sooner rather than later. I didn't hate her. I didn't think I even could. I was sad, sure, but I wasn't angry anymore. Life was complicated, and sometimes people make choices they think are best at the time, even when they're wrong. I wasn't sure what would happen next for either of us. Maybe she'd go back to Adam. Maybe she'd focus on Max and try to rebuild what they'd lost. I didn't know, and at that moment, I didn't need to. I just needed to let go. So, that's what I did. We didn't have a big, dramatic ending. No slamming doors, no shouting. It was just two people realizing that their lives had grown too far apart, that things couldn't go back to the way they were. And that was okay. Some endings are quiet. Some breakups aren't about hate or betrayal, but about accepting that the life you built together isn't the life that will take you forward. It's just part of the past now. And sometimes, that's enough. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. New cheating wife stories tomorrow.